There have been 4 major realignment moves for the Big Ten Conference. Which one has benefited the Big Ten most as we talk right now in 2023? Before we get to that, just a reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Big Ten content all off-season long. Always crush that like button to spread the word of Big Ten TED to the masses. I firmly believe there's an argument to be made for probably every one of these moves to be the most impactful move, to be the move that has benefited the Big Ten Conference the most. One sticks out in my mind, but before I get to the one, I'm going to go through each one of them. First, of course, the initial move, 1993 Penn State. It's to be argued that none of these other moves would be possible if not for this move, right? When Penn State initially joined the 1993 season, this was an elite college football program in the Big Ten Conference from day one. And I think that was huge. How they hit the ground running right away. Of course, we know how this team was under Joe Paterno throughout the 80s and into the 90s. That was kind of really the big part of Penn State football when they transitioned from that Eastern Independence, when they were doing really good in the late 80s, and then they turned it on in the early 90s, and they won a Big Ten championship in just their second season in the Big Ten Conference in 1994. And that set the tone. This was a 9-win team, a 10-win team, an 11-win team, right, for a majority of their early part in the Big Ten Conference. When you take a look at a model way for a Big Ten member to come in on the football field, it's Penn State. It's how they did it. When you look at USC coming in 2024, they want USC to be just like how Penn State was. They want them to be an instant contention right away to add depth to the conference at the top. I'll get into this later in the video when I talk about maybe who I think it benefited the Big Ten the most. But having that elite college football power and having that elite team in the Big Ten right away, I think really solidified this conference right out the gate throughout the mid-90s and into the late 90s. And really you saw Penn State grow into a full Big Ten member, battles with Ohio State, battles with Michigan, the Land-Grant Trophy, and Michigan State. Penn State definitely is up there and to be considered. Nebraska, right, it was a long time before the Big Ten, almost 20 years before the Big Ten added another team. Nebraska was the 12th member to the Big Ten Conference. Now, when the Huskers joined, this was not the Nebraska of the late 90s. This was not the Nebraska even of the early 2000s. We knew those days were behind us, but the interest for the Big Ten in adding Nebraska was just the sheer amount of the fan base and the sheer amount of the eyeballs that were going to watch Nebraska. We all know, and we all know to this day, that Nebraska is one of, if not the biggest fan base in all of college football. And with that brings a lot of eyes to a lot of Nebraska football, a lot of Nebraska basketball, and a lot of Nebraska volleyball. I think maybe where Nebraska has fallen short on the football field, I think they've really picked up the slack in other departments. Well, the one big thing that I think Nebraska can really hold their hat on is Nebraska volleyball has really propped up the Big Ten into being one of the best, if not the best, volleyball conference in the entire country. But football-wise, this is a team that for in those early years, Bo Pelini, they were a solid team, 9 and 10 win teams, but they never really competed at the top. They made it to a Big Ten championship game, but they ended up getting boat raced in that football game. But this is not a football program that has delivered for the Big Ten Conference. Okay, this has been, especially as of late, this has been a football program that has played well below expectations. And when the Big Ten added Nebraska, they were hoping to get a brand on the football field that was going to be consistently towards the top of the Big Ten. And it hasn't happened. I think the early part of the big, that Bo Pelini era, I think that's what we were kind of expecting. 9 wins, 10 wins type of deal. But once that dropped off, I think that really hurt the depth of the Big Ten Conference. And I really think it hurt the conference as a whole because you have this team that everybody knows has a long-standing tradition, that everybody knows can be good and probably should be an 8, 9, 10-win program, and it's just not. And it hurts the depth and the image, so to speak, of the Big Ten Conference. Rutgers and Maryland. This is a very interesting one because when you talk about benefiting the Big Ten, the addition of Rutgers and Maryland drove up big time the financial gains of the Big Ten Conference. Check out a video I recently did about this. Titled, Has Rutgers and Maryland Added Value to the Big Ten Conference? Because there's a lot of information in there that proves that when you talk about financials, when you talk about at the end of the late 2020s going into 2030, when you talk about the Big Ten Conference and its member schools making about $100 million each towards the end of that deal, a big reason why is because of what Rutgers and Maryland brought to the conference, right? It brings a lot of that New York City market on the East Coast, the Washington, D.C., the television markets, the East Coast alumni, and all of that I talked about in that previous video. That was the bridge. Rutgers and Maryland was the bridge to the Big Ten making a boatload of money and the Big Ten adding USC and UCLA. If I'm talking about moves that benefited the Big Ten the most financially and maybe television-wise, it's hard to ignore Rutgers and Maryland. Moving on to the last one, USC and UCLA, there's a high probability that if this video was made, and maybe I'll make a follow-up to this in a few years, that I would have picked USC and UCLA because they bring it all. They bring a blue blood football program. They bring a blue blood men's basketball program. They bring one of the largest television markets in the country, and they bring one of the hottest recruiting bases in the country as well. USC and UCLA is the full package, but we just haven't seen it yet to see if this move truly is going to benefit the Big Ten. Is USC and UCLA just going to keep all the recruits to themselves and all the other Big Ten teams won't benefit from going into Southern California? Are they going to do as well? Maybe they'll falter. Maybe they only win 8 or 9 win games every year. We just haven't seen it yet. But the potential is there for USC and UCLA to be the most beneficial to the Big Ten Conference. So having all of that information gathered, which one of these expansion moves benefited the Big Ten Conference the most? To me, Nebraska, Rutgers, Maryland, USC, UCLA would not have happened if it weren't for Penn State. Because that Penn State move was so big. I mentioned how they were immediately successful in the football field, and that immediately upped the status of the Big Ten Conference away from the Big Two and the Little Eight, and all of a sudden you had another addition to that Big Two, making it a Big Three, so to speak, and that really continued to carry on for the most part throughout present day. Penn State has been a team that has provided strength at the top on the football side of things, and we know that's most important. Because if the Penn State doesn't join the Big Ten in 1993, they probably go, Joe Paterno had an idea of an East Coast conference, and if they don't go there, maybe they go with Florida State to the ACC. There's a high possibility that the Nittany Lions and the Seminoles go as a pair to the ACC, and at that point, in the 90s, when you have Florida State, Penn State, Miami was not far behind. That could have been a true East Coast power conference. And the Big Ten wouldn't have made any moves. It would have been the SEC, right? They made the move with Arkansas, South Carolina. It would have been the ACC over here. You know, it would have been those conferences, the SEC and the ACC, that might have separated themselves at that point from conferences like the Big Ten, from conferences like the Pac-10. There's even a possibility that maybe the Big Ten, if they didn't make the move at that time, and of course Notre Dame signed an exclusive agreement with NBC, where would have been their move? Where would have been their move? Teams in the Big Ten would have watched Penn State and Florida State and Virginia Tech and eventually Miami over in the ACC become one of the most powerful conferences in all of college football. Penn State was the pendulum. I think that swung things in favor of the Big Ten and provided the Big Ten with some depth at the top and provided some elite level of play on the football field at the top. And that eventually sprung, that allowed them to become one of the best conferences in all of college football. And that allowed them to continue that expansion further and further and further. Because TV markets aren't to be had, hundreds of millions of dollars aren't to be had if Penn State doesn't establish the Big Ten as one of the best college football conferences in the country throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. I want to hear what you guys think. Who do you think was the biggest value that benefited the Big Ten Conference the most over the course of their expansion? I want to hear your comments in the comments down below. Where else would comments go? Make sure you smash the like button. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.